The doors opened at precisely 8 o'clock, and she walked in. No invitation, no escort, no name that anyone in that room recognized. Just a woman in an unadorned green dress, standing near the threshold of one of the most important halls in the county, with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. The Count saw her immediately, and before he had formed a single coherent thought about who she was or why she was there, he said it, quietly, to the man beside him, as if it were simply a fact requiring no further examination. She does not belong in that hall. By the end of that evening, he would understand how completely he had been wrong. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins the way the most important ones always do, with a door opening and a woman walking through it, and a room that had no idea what had just arrived. The doors of Aldermoor Hall opened at precisely 8 o'clock, and the world that entered through them was a world that knew exactly what it was worth. The women arrived in silks that caught the candlelight like still water, their necks carrying pearls that had been in families longer than the memories of the people who wore them. The men moved with the particular ease of those who have never needed to explain themselves, not their presence, not their opinions, not the space they occupied. It was the kind of gathering that had a grammar of its own, and everyone inside it had been speaking that grammar since birth. Everyone, that is, except her. She had come in through the main entrance, which was already a kind of transgression. She wore no jewels. Her dress was a deep, unadorned bottle green, well cut, quietly expensive, but without ornament, without the small signals of rank that the room had been trained since childhood to read. She carried no fan, no companion, no card of introduction. She simply walked in and stood for a moment near the threshold, her eyes moving across the room with a calm, unhurried attention that was somehow more unsettling than any grand entrance could have been. Several people noticed her. None of them knew what to make of what they saw. Lord Cassius Aldermoor noticed her from across the room. He had been mid-sentence in a conversation about the railway expansion, a conversation he had no interest in finishing, when something in his peripheral vision made him stop. He turned. He saw her. And before he had formed a single coherent thought about who she was or why she was there, he said, in a low voice intended only for the man standing beside him, "She does not belong in that hall." His companion agreed immediately. They were both, in different ways, entirely wrong. Before I tell you who she really was and what she was carrying into that hall, if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. This is the kind of story that stays with you long after it ends. Now, let's go back to where it all began. She had not always been Isadora Vane. Or rather, she had always been Isadora Vane, but the world had not always known what that name meant. She had grown up in the county of Westholt, in a house that was neither grand nor humble, in a family that had been quietly, steadily comfortable for 2 generations, before a single bad winter and a worse business decision had taken most of what they had. Her father had died owing debts he was too proud to speak of. Her mother had followed him within the year, not from illness, but from the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent a lifetime holding things together and simply, one morning, stopped. Isadora had been 23. She had settled what could be settled, sold what had to be sold, and left Westholt before the sympathy of neighbors could curdle into something she didn't want to receive. The years that followed had not been easy, but they had been hers. She had worked as a copyist for a firm of solicitors in the city, quietly invaluable, carefully invisible. She had read everything she could find. She had saved with a discipline that looked, to outside eyes, like austerity, but felt to her like building. Slowly, patiently, she had rebuilt not just her circumstances, but her understanding of how the world was arranged, who held power, how it was maintained, and where, if one looked carefully enough, it was fragile. By the time she was 27, she had accumulated something that could not be spent or lost, a precise and unsentimental knowledge of how the game was played. She had come to Aldermoor Hall because someone in that room owed her something. She intended to collect. She had not been invited. This had not troubled her greatly. Invitations, she had come to understand, were simply the mechanism by which rooms decided who was allowed to be seen. She had observed during her years of quiet work that the people who were truly dangerous to the existing order were never sent invitations, because the existing order, by definition, did not wish to be disturbed. She had also observed that no one, in practice, checked the guest list at a gathering of this size. She had dressed appropriately. She had arrived at the correct hour. She had walked through the door with the unhurried confidence of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was. The rest, as she had calculated, was simply a matter of not flinching. Lord Cassius Aldermoor had been the Count of Aldermoor for 11 years, inheriting the title at 26 after his father's death from a sudden illness that had given them no time for a proper farewell, and left Cassius with a grief he had never quite learned to carry in a way that didn't show. He had responded to that grief the way men of his position so often did, by tightening everything. He had become precise, methodical, exacting. He had set standards for his household that were understood to be non-negotiable, and had applied those same standards to his social world, to the gatherings he hosted, the guests he received, and the degree of disorder he was willing to tolerate. None. That was the answer. The degree of disorder he was willing to tolerate was none. He was not, by any measure, an unkind man. His staff did not fear him. They respected him, which was more durable and, in its way, more demanding. He paid fair wages and did not shout, and had, on 2 occasions that were quietly remembered in the servants' hall, intervened personally when a member of his staff was being treated poorly by a guest. But there was a category of person that Cassius Aldermoor had never developed the machinery to understand. The person who arrived without a place, without a name that his world recognized, without any of the signals that told you who someone was and therefore how to arrange yourself around them. Such people made him uneasy in a way he had never examined closely enough to name. He had not examined it tonight. He had simply seen a woman he did not know, standing in his hall without apology, and his first instinct, clean, immediate, unquestioned, had been to determine how she had gotten in, and to ensure it did not happen again. He had tasked his man, a sharp-eyed footman named Devereux, with finding out who she was. Devereux had returned 12 minutes later, with an expression Cassius did not entirely understand. "I cannot find her name on the list, my lord," the man had said, "but Tobias knows her. Or rather, Tobias says he knows who she is." Cassius had looked across the room at the woman in green. She was, at that moment, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing tray with the quiet ease of someone who had never once in her life doubted her right to it. "Send Tobias to me," Cassius had said. There was a small pocket sewn into the inner seam of Isadora's dress, so flat against the fabric that it was invisible, that it had been designed to be invisible by a seamstress in the city who had asked no questions and accepted the commission with the professional discretion of someone who had made pockets like this before for women, in circumstances she had learned not to inquire about. Inside the pocket was a single folded document, worn at the creases from having been opened and closed many times over the past 8 months. It was not a letter. It was not a deed, not a contract, not anything with official wax or formal language. It was a handwritten record, 2 pages in a careful small script, of a transaction that had taken place 11 years ago, in the weeks immediately following the death of her father. She had found it entirely by accident, buried in a box of her father's papers that she had not opened until she was ready. Truly ready, in the practical sense, not merely emotionally, to go through them. She had been sitting at a table in the small room she rented in the city, a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, working through documents she had expected to be nothing more than old receipts and outdated correspondence. The record had been folded inside a water-damaged ledger, as if it had been placed there deliberately, hidden where someone searching for it might not think to look, but accessible to someone who knew the papers well enough to go through them completely. She had read it once. She had put it down. She had made herself a fresh cup of tea. And then she had read it again, slowly, with the kind of attention you give to something that is rearranging the floor beneath you. What the document described was a debt, not her father's debt, but a debt owed to her father, by a man who had borrowed a substantial sum at a moment of private difficulty and had never repaid it. The man's name was written in her father's hand, clearly and without ambiguity. The terms were noted. The date was noted. There were no witnesses, which was, Isadora had come to understand, precisely the point. This had been a private arrangement between two men who trusted each other, one of whom had subsequently died without ever collecting what was owed to him. The other man had gone on to prosper. He had inherited a title. He had become the Count of Aldermoor, and he was standing, at this moment, 40 feet away from her, looking across the room with the narrow attention of a man trying to determine if she was a problem he needed to solve before the evening was out. It was Lady Philippa Strone who noticed her second, and Lady Philippa who moved first. She was a tall woman with copper hair dressed in an elaborate style that required, Isadora had once been told, no fewer than 4 separate hairpins and the patience of a saint, and she wore it with the confident stillness of someone who knew it was being looked at. She was understood by the county to be the woman Lord Aldermoor would eventually marry, not because he had said so exactly, but because these things had a way of becoming understood in rooms like this, through the accumulation of small signals that added up over time, to a presumption that no one had directly challenged, and so had quietly calcified into near certainty. Lady Philippa had, in the meantime, arranged herself accordingly. She approached Isadora with the particular smile of a woman who has decided to be gracious to someone she considers beneath her, a smile that is warm enough to be defensible and cool enough to communicate everything that matters. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said, in a voice pitched just carefully enough to carry to the 2 women standing nearby, who had been watching with the focused attention of those who have correctly identified something interesting. "I am Lady Philippa Strone, and you are—" She let the sentence open like a door she fully expected to close again in a moment, once the necessary information had established her own position relative to the newcomer. It was, Isadora recognized, a masterpiece of the form. Friendly, correct, lethal. Isadora looked at her. She did not rush to fill the space Lady Philippa had created. She let the silence sit for one beat, just one, long enough to make it a choice rather than a hesitation. Then she said, "Isadora Vane." No title. No county of origin. No explanation of how she came to be there. No social landmark to which Philippa could anchor her and thereby rank her. Just a name, offered with the complete serenity of someone who found it entirely sufficient. Lady Philippa's smile stayed exactly where it was, which required, Isadora suspected, some effort. The 2 women nearby exchanged a glance that was doing a great deal of work. Across the room, without appearing to, Lord Aldermoor watched. Tobias had been a footman at Aldermoor Hall for 31 years. He had seen 4 seasons of renovations, 2 changes of title, and more gatherings than he could count, each one blurring, over time, into the general texture of a life spent in service. He had developed, across those decades, the particular talent of the long employed, the ability to see everything while appearing to see nothing. He noticed things, he filed them away. He said very little about most of them, because that was the arrangement, not a spoken one, but the kind that is understood by anyone who has worked long enough in a house that belongs to someone else. Tonight, however, when Devereux had pulled him aside and asked him quietly if he knew the woman in green, Tobias had not hesitated. He had looked across the room. He had gone very still. And then he had said, "Yes, I know who she is." He had met her father once, only once, more than a decade ago, in the weeks before everything had changed. He had been running an errand in the village and had encountered a man outside the solicitor's office, waiting with the patient stillness of someone who had learned to wait without letting it show. They had exchanged only a few words, the kind that happened between strangers sharing a doorway out of the rain. But Tobias remembered faces the way some people remembered music, completely, without effort, without decay. And the woman standing in his employer's hall had the same dark, unhurried eyes, the same quality of attention, the same stillness that was not passivity, but its precise opposite, a person fully present and fully prepared, watching and weighing, and not yet ready to move. He had known it the moment he saw her. He had known it, and he had said nothing to anyone for the better part of an hour, because he needed first to understand what she had come here to do. He told Lord Aldermoor only what was necessary, that her name was Isadora Vane, that she was the daughter of a man named Arthur Vane of Westholt, and that her father had been at one time a person of some significance in the county, before circumstances had changed. He did not say what those circumstances were. He did not say what he suspected about why she was here. He watched the Count's face as the name landed, watched for the flicker, the recalibration, the small rearrangement that happens when a piece of information arrives that you were not prepared to receive. And it was there, brief, controlled, quickly covered. But Tobias had been watching faces in this hall for 31 years. He had seen it. He had noted it. And he had gone back to his post by the door, carrying the weight of it quietly, the way he had always carried the things he knew. The supper arrangements at Aldermoor Hall were elaborate in the way that only houses with a great deal of staff and a host with exacting standards could sustain. The long table in the dining room seated 40, and every place had been assigned in advance, carefully, with the full geometry of rank and relationship that governed such things. Isadora had not been assigned a seat. This was, she had understood from the moment she arrived, inevitable. She had not come expecting to sit at the table. She had come to be in the room, and there is a difference. The one who sits at the table is managed, placed, contained within the structure. The one who stands near the window with a glass of champagne and an expression of complete composure belongs, in a sense, to no one. When a younger woman, one of Lady Philippa's particular set, with a quick, sharp prettiness and the social confidence of someone who has never been uncertain of her welcome, suggested, with a sweetness that did not quite reach her eyes, that Isadora might be more comfortable waiting in the anteroom during supper, Isadora had turned to her with the same unhurried attention she gave everyone. "Thank you," she had said, without moving. "I'm quite comfortable here." And she had turned back to the window, as if the matter had been entirely resolved, which, in the particular way she had delivered it, it had been. The young woman had opened her mouth, found she had nothing adequate to say, and had withdrawn. It was the kind of exchange that appears, in retrospect, entirely minor, and yet somehow everyone nearby remembered it precisely. She spent the supper hour in the music room, which adjoined the dining room through a set of tall double doors left slightly ajar. She did not intrude, she did not perform her presence. She simply stood near the instrument, a beautiful Broadwood grand that had not, she suspected, from the slight dustiness of the keys, been played in some months, and rested one hand lightly on its surface with a familiarity that suggested she was not encountering a piano for the first time. One of the older gentlemen, emerging from the dining room early with a glass of port, stopped when he saw her. He looked at the piano. He looked at her hand. He said, "Do you play?" She had answered without looking up, "I did. Once." He had stood there a moment longer than he intended. Then he had gone back inside and said something to the man beside him, and that man had turned to look through the open doors, and so the quiet fact of her, her stillness, her presence, the hand on the piano, had begun, almost without her intending it, to travel around the room. She has not raised her voice once. She has not explained herself to anyone who did not deserve the explanation. and she has not yet shown a single person in that hall what she is actually carrying. But in the next part of this story, Lord Aldermoor is going to find out, and what happens in that alcove will change everything you thought you understood about why she came. It was not planned. Or rather, it had been possible, in the abstract way that certain things are possible when the circumstances align correctly. But Isadora had not arrived at Aldermoor Hall intending to play. She had arrived with a document in her pocket and a purpose, and the piano had simply been there. But after supper, when the guests moved back through the hall and the formal arrangements of the evening began to loosen slightly, when conversations broke into smaller currents and people drifted and the particular pressure of being observed all at once diminished into something more manageable, one of the older women, a widow named Mrs. Kane, who had been watching Isadora with undisguised curiosity all evening, had said, "My dear, I'm told you play. Not a question. An invitation. The kind that comes from a woman who has enough standing in the room to make the invitation itself mean something." Isadora had sat down at the Broadwood without ceremony. She had not adjusted the bench, not shuffled her music, not performed the small preparatory rituals of the accomplished amateur. She had simply placed her hands on the keys and begun. What she played was a nocturne, not one of the fashionable pieces everyone recognized, but something older and quieter, and considerably more difficult. The kind of composition that requires not just technical precision, but a quality of emotional honesty that cannot be faked and cannot be learned from practice alone. It must be felt. She felt it. The room understood this within the first 4 bars. Conversations did not stop immediately. They slowed, the way water slows before it stills, each voice dropping a degree until the room had quieted around the music the way a forest quiets around a sound it hasn't heard before. Lord Aldermoor stood near the fireplace at the far end of the room. He had been speaking with a gentleman about something he would not later be able to recall. He had stopped speaking. He was aware of this. He was also aware that across the room, the woman he had declared did not belong in his hall was producing from an instrument that had sat untouched for most of the year, something that was making the room rearrange itself around her. People had turned, not all at once, gradually, the way attention moves when it is drawn by something genuine rather than performed. Lady Philippa stood very still near the windows, her expression fixed in something that was trying to be appreciation and was not quite managing it. Tobias at the door watched with his hands folded and his face arranged as it always was, neutral, correct. But his eyes held something that might, in a different light, have been called relief. He told himself he was watching because the situation required it. There was a woman in his house whose name he had not recognized, had told himself he had not recognized, and whose presence required explanation, and it was entirely reasonable, as the host of this gathering, to pay attention to what she was doing. This was what he told himself. It was not entirely the truth. The truth was that he had been watching Isadora Vane since she walked through his door, and not once in that entire evening had she done anything he could have predicted. She had declined to be managed. She had declined to be embarrassed. She had declined, with a composure so complete it bordered on something rarer and more unsettling than confidence, to behave like someone who did not belong. And now she was sitting at his piano, playing music that had made his hall go quiet, and he was standing across the room, unable to look away, and he was not certain, for the first time in a very long while, what to do next. He knew the name Vane. He had known it the moment Tobias said it, though he had taken considerable care not to let that knowing show on his face. Arthur Vane of Westholt had been a man he encountered exactly once in his life, in a private capacity, at a moment of acute financial difficulty in the early years of his inheritance. A moment he had managed, eventually, and then, in the way of such things, had allowed himself to file somewhere not quite at the surface of his memory. Not forgotten. That would have required a kind of active dishonesty that Cassius was not, on balance, capable of. Simply set aside. The debt had been private, personal, and the man it was owed to had died. His heir, as far as Cassius had understood, had disappeared entirely from the county. He had allowed himself, over 11 years, to believe that the matter had resolved itself the way unpleasant things sometimes do, through the simple passage of time and the absence of anyone left to press the claim. The music ended. The room was silent for a moment, genuinely silent, the kind that follows something real, not the polite pause that follows something merely competent. Then the applause began, warm and unfeigned, and Isadora rose from the bench with the same undisturbed composure with which she had sat down. She turned, and for the first time that evening, her eyes found his directly, across the full length of the room, through the candlelight and the gathered crowd and the 12 feet of Persian carpet that lay between them. She did not smile. She did not look away. She simply looked at him with those dark, unhurried eyes, for precisely long enough to make it clear that the look was intentional. And then she turned to Mrs. Kane, who was saying something warm, and gave the older woman her full attention, as if the moment had not happened at all. He had not come to this evening intending to carry anything of significance. The letter had been delivered that afternoon, and he had read it in his study, with the window open and the autumn light coming in sideways, and he had folded it and put it in his breast pocket with the intention of deciding later what to do about it. Later had not yet arrived. The letter was from his solicitor, Mr. Aldous Pembridge, and it concerned a matter Cassius had asked about 2 months ago, almost idly, almost as an afterthought, when he had been going through some old accounts and had found, among the papers, a reference to a private loan made in the first year of his countship. He had asked Pembridge, with the careful vagueness of a man who does not wish to appear too interested in the answer, to determine whether any legal claim against that loan still existed, whether anyone had the standing or the evidence to pursue it. Pembridge's answer had been thorough, as it always was, and unwelcome, as Cassius had feared it might be. The claim, Pembridge wrote, had not expired. The terms of the original arrangement, which were, his solicitor noted with a delicacy that did not quite conceal his concern, unusually specific for an informal agreement, did not include a limitation period. More significantly, the document recording the transaction had never been destroyed and could not be assumed to be lost. Pembridge had added, in a sentence that Cassius had read 3 times, "If the daughter of Arthur Vane is alive and in possession of that record, she would have a legitimate claim to the full principal sum, with interest compounded from the date of the original transaction. The sum would be considerable." He had underlined the word considerable himself, in pencil, with a firmness that suggested he felt it did not entirely capture the situation. Cassius had put the letter in his pocket. He had come downstairs. He had opened his hall to 40 guests, spoken about railways, and watched a woman walk through his front door in an unadorned green dress, carrying nothing visible and everything that mattered. He touched the letter now through the fabric of his coat, a small, barely conscious gesture, the kind a man makes when he is reminding himself of something he cannot afford to forget. Across the room, Isadora Vane was speaking quietly with the widow Mrs. Kane, her head tilted slightly in the attentive posture of someone genuinely listening. She laughed at something the older woman said, a real laugh, quick and unguarded, there and gone before it could be studied. Cassius watched it happen. He found that it made things considerably more complicated. It was Lord Harwick, a broad, florid man in his late 50s who moved through rooms with the ease of someone who has never once been asked to justify his presence, who decided, after his second glass of port, that the mystery of the woman in green required direct resolution. He approached her with the bluff cordiality of someone who considers directness a virtue and tact an affectation, and he asked her, in front of 4 other people, what her business was in the county. Not an impolite question exactly, not in the form, but in the intent, it was something else. An invitation to explain herself, to account for herself, to produce, for inspection, the credentials that would allow the room to decide what she was worth. Isadora looked at him with the patience one might give a child who has asked an interesting but slightly confused question. "My business," she said, "is my own, Lord Harwick." She said it without sharpness, without apology, with only that steadiness she carried everywhere, as if the answer were simply the most accurate one available, and she saw no reason to dress it otherwise. Harwick laughed, a short, surprised sound that was not entirely unkind. "Come now," he said. "Everyone has a connection here. Whose guest are you?" Isadora had considered this for a moment that felt, to those watching, very precisely calibrated. "I came on my own account," she said. "As it happens, I find that the most reliable kind of connection." Harwick opened his mouth, closed it, and then laughed again, this time more genuinely, with a shake of his head that conceded something without quite admitting it. Lord Aldermoor had been close enough to hear the exchange. He had not been close enough, by his own calculation, to intervene without its being obvious that he had been listening. He had heard every word. He had also heard the thing beneath the words. The texture of a person who had decided, long before this evening, exactly how much of herself she intended to give to rooms that had not yet earned it. He understood that texture, in the abstract. He had simply never encountered it in someone who had a document in their possession that concerned him directly. The situation, he was beginning to understand, required something more careful and more honest than the dismissal he had offered his companion at the start of the evening. He set down his glass. He crossed the room. Not quickly. There was nothing quick about Cassius Aldermoor when he had decided to be deliberate. He walked toward her with the unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision, and he stopped at the correct distance, and he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Miss Vane, I wonder if you might walk with me for a moment." She walked with him toward the far end of the hall, where the candlelight thinned, and the noise of the gathering became a low, distant current behind them. Neither of them spoke immediately. This was, Isadora recognized, a test of the same kind she had already passed several times that evening. The test of who would fill the silence first, and what that filling would reveal. She did not fill it. She walked beside him with her hands at her sides and her eyes forward, and she let the silence be what it was. Lord Aldermoor, she noted, was a man who also understood silence. He did not rush. He waited until they had reached the alcove near the east window before he turned to face her, and when he spoke, his voice was level and without performance. "You came here for a reason," he said. It was not a question. She appreciated that. She had not planned to tell him the whole of it tonight. She had planned to be seen, to establish her presence in his house, in his hall, among the people who knew him, and to let that presence do its quiet work before she moved to anything more direct. But standing here, in the thinning light, with this man looking at her, with an attention that was neither hostile nor dismissive, but simply, plainly honest, she recalculated. There are moments when the carefully constructed approach becomes less useful than the truth. And this was one of them. She reached into the inner seam of her dress and withdrew the folded document. She held it for a moment, without offering it. "My father," she said, "was Arthur Vane. You borrowed from him 11 years ago. He died without collecting what you owed. I have spent the better part of a year determining whether what he left me was enough to press the claim." She paused. "It is." He looked at the document in her hand. He did not reach for it. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been half expecting and fully dreading, with a recognition that was neither surprise nor relief, but something between the two, a settling, as if a weight that had been held at an angle for a very long time had finally been set down squarely. "How much?" he said, and she heard in those two words not evasion but calculation, the kind that belongs to a man who has decided to face a thing and is determining the dimensions of it before he speaks again. She told him the figure, not the minimum. The full principal, with interest, as Pembridge had calculated it, compounded across 11 years to a number that had, the first time she saw it written down, made her sit very still for several minutes before she trusted herself to react. He did not flinch. She noted that. She noted it carefully. He asked her to give him until morning, not to disappear. He said that directly, with a frankness she had not anticipated, but to consider how to proceed in a way that did not require either of them to perform this conversation in the middle of a room full of people who would make it into something it was not. She had looked at him for a long moment. She had weighed it. She had decided, on the basis of nothing more verifiable than the quality of his attention, that he was not asking for time in order to escape, but in order to think, and that there was a difference, and that the difference mattered. "I will be at the Creston Inn until Thursday," she had said. "If I have not heard from you by Wednesday evening, I will proceed through proper legal channels. I would prefer not to." He had held her gaze. "So would I," he had said. And that had been the whole of it. She had put the document back into her pocket, and they had walked back toward the gathering, and no one who watched them return could have said with certainty whether what had just happened was significant or nothing at all. But Lord Harwick, who missed very little when he put his mind to it, had watched them walk back from the alcove, and had noted the particular quality of the silence between them. Not the silence of a concluded argument, not the silence of a social obligation discharged, but the silence of two people who have said something real to each other and are still living inside the weight of it. He filed this away with the professional instinct of a man who has learned over many decades that the most interesting things at a gathering are always the things that happen at the edges of it, in the thin light, away from the table. He said nothing, but he watched. And what he watched, for the remainder of the evening, was Lord Aldermoor moving through his own hall with a slightly different quality of attention, present as he had always been, but also beneath that presence, occupied with something invisible and consequential. Isadora, for her part, returned to the gathering and did not look for him again. She spoke with Mrs. Kane about a botanical expedition the older woman had undertaken in her youth. She accepted a second glass of champagne. She stood near the fire for a time, and felt the warmth of it against her back, and listened to the sound of the room, the low percussion of voices, the clink of glass, the particular acoustics of a large, old house, holding 40 people inside its walls on a cold autumn evening. And she felt, for the first time since she had walked through those doors, something that was not quite relaxation but was close to it. She had done what she came to do. She had been seen. She had spoken. She had given him the document and taken it back, and now the next move was his, and she had learned long ago that the hardest and most necessary skill in any contest of consequence was the ability to wait without weakening. Tobias found her near the end of the evening, when the guests were beginning to call for their carriages, and the hall was thinning out in the slow, ceremonious way of gatherings that have run their proper course. He approached her, without the hesitation of a man uncertain of his welcome, and without the deference of one who has forgotten he has something worth saying. He simply came to stand beside her, at a slight angle that made the conversation look, to anyone watching, like nothing more than a footman attending a guest. "I knew your father," he said, in a voice pitched exactly for her ears and no one else's. "I met him once. Outside Pembridge's office, in the village. It was raining." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes forward. "He was a good man," Tobias said. "Patient. Careful. The kind who does what he says and says what he means." He paused. "You have his eyes." She did not speak immediately. There are things that arrive when you are not prepared for them, not because you have failed to prepare, but because some things cannot be braced against. They must simply be received. She received this one quietly, with her chin level and her hand still, and her breath even. And only someone standing very close would have seen the slight shift in her expression. The way something that had been held compressed for a very long time, moved briefly toward the surface, and was then gently, deliberately returned. "Thank you," she said at last. Her voice was steady. Tobias nodded once, the small, decisive nod of a man who has done what he came to do. He moved to withdraw. Then he stopped. "He would not have wanted you to be hard about it," he said, still without looking at her. "The claim is right. But how you press it, that's the part that lasts." He returned to his post before she could answer. She stood with his words for a long moment, turning them over the way you turn over something you intend to keep. It was the kind of counsel that comes, rarely, from the people no one thinks to ask, the ones who have been in the room for decades, watching, carrying things they were never invited to say. Isadora had learned, during her years of quiet work among solicitors and documents, and the machinery of other people's arrangements, that the most accurate understanding of any situation was usually held by the person standing nearest the door. They see the arrivals and the departures. They observe the face before it composes itself for company, and after it has released that composition at the end of a long evening. Tobias had stood at this door for 31 years. He had seen her father once, and remembered his eyes. He had seen Lord Aldermoor's face when he heard her name, and he had known what that face was trying not to show. Whatever he had decided to carry quietly, across all those years, he had chosen tonight to set one piece of it down. She would not waste it. Tobias just told her the one thing she was not prepared to hear. And what she does with it, how she decides to press what is rightfully hers, is going to determine not just the outcome of the claim, but the kind of person she chooses to be when the moment finally comes. Stay with me. The most important part of this story is still ahead. The years between Westholt and Aldermoor Hall had not been spectacular, which was precisely how she had intended them. She had understood early that spectacle draws attention, and attention, in her particular situation, a young woman with no family, no title, and a grievance that could not yet be pursued, was dangerous. What she had built instead was the kind of foundation that does not photograph well: knowledge, discipline, the slow accumulation of competence across several adjacent fields. The solicitor's office where she worked had handled estates, inheritance disputes, and the particular category of financial entanglement that arises when gentlemen of standing make private arrangements they later find inconvenient to honor. She had copied documents by the thousand. She had read everything she was permitted to read, and a great deal she was not, with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understands that the knowledge itself is the asset. She had also, quietly and without announcing it, saved. Not a comfortable amount, a serious amount. The kind that required the sustained application of a will that most people reserve for emergencies, and she had simply made her permanent condition. By the time she found her father's record, she did not need the money in any immediate sense. She had built herself past needing it. What she needed, what she had been circling for 8 months from the moment she understood what the document meant, was not the sum itself, but what the sum represented. The acknowledgement that her father's word had meant something, that what had been taken from her family had been real, and that the world was capable, under the right pressure, applied in the right way, of admitting it. That was what she had come to Aldermoor Hall to collect. The money was evidence. The acknowledgement was the point. She had confided this, once, to the only person she trusted with the whole of it, Mr. Fenwick Crail, a solicitor who had left the firm 2 years before she found the document and had set up an independent practice in the city, and who had been, during her years at the firm, the one person on the staff who treated her work as work rather than as a tolerated anomaly. She had gone to him with the record and her calculations and the full account of what she intended to do. And he had listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of respect she had learned not to take for granted. When she finished, he had said, "The claim is solid. The strategy is sound. The only thing that can defeat it is if you go in angry." She had told him she was not angry. He had looked at her with the measuring patience of a man who has been a solicitor for 30 years. "Good," he had said. "Stay that way." Wednesday came. No word arrived at the Creston Inn from Lord Aldermoor. Not by morning, not by afternoon. Not by the time the light began to leave the sky and the innkeeper's wife brought up a tray of supper, Isadora barely touched. She had expected this was possible. She had prepared for it. She sent a note to Mr. Fenwick Crail at his city address, brief and without elaboration. Proceed as discussed. Then she dressed the following morning in the same green dress, secured the document in its inner pocket, and walked back to Aldermoor Hall, not to a grand evening gathering, but to the quiet administrative hour of mid-morning, when the house was occupied with its own business, and the arrival of a visitor, without appointment, carried a different weight entirely. She was admitted by Tobias, who opened the door and said nothing and stepped aside with the precise, unreadable courtesy of a man who has been expecting this and made his private peace with it. She was shown to a small receiving room off the main corridor. Not the formal drawing room, not the library, but the functional middle space of a house that is being asked to deal with something it did not schedule. She sat. She did not look around the room with the evaluating eye of a visitor assessing her welcome. She folded her hands in her lap and was still, the way she was always still when something was about to happen, and stillness was the most powerful thing available to her. When Lord Aldermoor entered, he was not alone. Beside him was a man she did not recognize, middle-aged, careful, carrying a leather document case with the habitual grip of someone who carries it everywhere. His solicitor she understood immediately, Pembridge. Cassius Aldermoor sat across from her and set a document on the table between them. Not the record she had brought. His own document, drawn up in the night by the look of it, the ink still carrying a slight freshness at the margins. She read it without touching it. It was an acknowledgment, formal, legally precise, in language that Pembridge had clearly drafted with the full weight of his professional caution, of the original loan, the accumulated interest, and the intention to settle the debt in full within 30 days. There was a second clause she had not anticipated, a formal record of Arthur Vane's name attached to the document as the original creditor. Not just the settlement of a sum, the restoration of a name. She looked up at Cassius Aldermoor. He met her eyes with the directness of someone who has spent a sleepless night arriving at a decision and is not interested in retreating from it. "I should have done this years ago," he said. There was no performance in it, no bid for her forgiveness, no plea for her understanding. Simply a fact, offered plainly, by a man who had finally decided to be honest about it. He had not slept. She could see it in the quality of his stillness, not the composed stillness of a man at rest within himself, but the particular stillness of someone who has been awake long enough that movement has become an effort, and stillness is simply what remains. There were shadows beneath his eyes that the morning light did not flatter, and a slight tension at the line of his jaw that suggested he had spent the night not merely thinking, but contending with something internal, some account he had been carrying for 11 years, and had finally, in the sleepless hours between Wednesday evening and Thursday morning, been forced to open and read in full. She recognized that quality. She had spent her own nights with it in the early months after finding her father's record, working through the arithmetic of what had been lost and what it would take to recover it. It was not a comfortable process. It was, however, a necessary one. Pembridge had said very little since entering the room. He had set his case on the table, produced the document, and retreated to the chair nearest the wall with the professional composure of a man whose job is to witness and record rather than to participate. But she had caught his expression when she read the second clause, the restoration of her father's name. And what she saw there was not the neutral efficiency of the drafting solicitor, but something quieter and more personal, the expression of a man who had counseled his client through a long night and had perhaps, at some point in those hours, said something that had made a difference. She did not know what had passed between them. She was grateful, without knowing the specifics, that someone had been in the room with Cassius Aldermoor when he was deciding who he intended to be about this. She reached into her pocket and placed her own document on the table beside his. The two papers lay there together, his in fresh ink, hers worn at the creases from months of careful handling. And there was something about the image of them side by side that felt, to her, like the closing of a parenthesis that had been open for 11 years. She did not sign anything yet. She read his document a second time, with the thorough attention of someone who has spent years in a solicitor's office and knows that the place where agreements fail is always in the language rather than the intention. The language was sound. Pembridge, whatever else he was, knew his work. She set the document down. She looked at Cassius Aldermoor, and for the first time since she had walked into his hall 4 days ago, she allowed herself something that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory. A slight softening, an acknowledgement, the face of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and can feel at the edges the possibility of setting it down. She had one thing to say that was not in any document and could not be made into a clause and would not be recorded by Pembridge in his careful hand. She had known she needed to say it since Tobias had told her, the night of the gathering, that her father had been a good man, patient, careful, the kind who does what he says. She had been carrying it since then, this one thing, waiting for the right moment to offer it, because there are things that must be said face to face and in stillness, without the noise of a gathering around them, and without the formal machinery of legal proceedings as the frame. She said, "He never spoke of this debt with bitterness. I found that in his papers, too. Not the record itself, but letters written afterward. He believed you would honor it, eventually. He wrote that you were a man who understood obligation and that circumstances had made it difficult. He was not wrong about the obligation. He was perhaps too generous about the timeline." She paused. "I am not here because I am angry. I am here because his name deserved to be attached to something that was honored, and because I was the only person left who could make that happen." She folded her hands on the table. "That is all." The room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms are quiet after something real has been said. Not the silence of discomfort, not the silence of people searching for the correct response, but the silence of a space adjusting itself around a truth that has just been placed inside it. Cassius Aldermoor looked at her with an expression she did not try to interpret. Pembridge looked at his document case. Outside the window, the sound of the grounds, the wind in the old elms, the distant movement of horses in the stable yard, the particular texture of a late autumn morning in a house that had been standing for 200 years, came through faintly, as if the world outside were continuing on its own account, indifferent to what was being decided in this room, and it was only the three people inside it who understood that something had shifted. The news moved the way news always moves in a county that considers itself close-knit, not announced, never directly stated, but present by afternoon in every drawing room and dining room within a 10-mile radius, carried in the particular register of the half-said thing, the significant pause, the eyebrow raised and quickly lowered. What was known, or rather what was understood, which in these circles amounts to the same thing, was that the woman in green from the gathering at Aldermoor Hall had returned the following morning, and had remained for the better part of 2 hours, and that Lord Aldermoor's solicitor had been present, and that the Lord himself had not appeared in his usual Thursday appointments. The conclusion the county drew was imprecise in its details and entirely accurate in its substance. Something consequential had happened, and the woman without a name on the guest list was at the center of it. Lady Philippa heard it first from the wife of the man Harwick had whispered to on Thursday afternoon. She received the information with a stillness that was, those who knew her well would have said, not her natural state. She sat for some time after the conversation ended and looked at a point on the wall that was not a painting and not a window, but simply a wall. And she thought about the evening at Aldermoor Hall, about the woman in green at the piano, about the nocturne that had quieted the room, about the walk to the alcove and back, about the quality of the silence between two people who have said something real to each other. She had seen all of this. She had assessed it and filed it and told herself it was nothing. She understood now, sitting alone in her parlor on a Thursday afternoon, that she had made a significant error of evaluation. She rose. She called for her carriage. She had several visits to make before the day was done, and she intended to make them with the particular composure of someone who has decided to be gracious about a circumstance she cannot alter. By evening, when the county had finished arranging itself around the new information, when Harwick had told his version to 6 people, and Tobias had told no version to anyone, when Pembridge had filed his copy of the signed document and gone home to his supper. By that evening, the name Isadora Vane was in the air of every important room in the county. Not as a question any longer, not as an uncertainty, as a fact, as a person, as a woman who had walked into a room where she was not expected, had not asked for a chair, had played a nocturne that no one in that hall would entirely forget, and had walked out 2 days later, having accomplished precisely what she came to do, without raising her voice once. He sent a note to the Creston Inn on Friday morning. It was brief, 3 lines, and it asked nothing except whether she would agree to walk with him in the grounds of Aldermoor Hall that afternoon, if she had not yet departed the county. She had not yet departed. She read the note twice, set it on the table beside her untouched breakfast, and looked out the window at the autumn garden below, the late-season roses still holding their color against the cold, the elm trees along the road beginning to show their bones through the thinning leaves. She thought about Tobias's counsel. How you press it, that's the part that lasts. She had pressed it well. What came after the pressing was a different question, and one she had not entirely prepared herself to answer. She went. The grounds of Aldermoor Hall were magnificent in the way that only very old gardens are. Not the studied magnificence of a thing designed to impress, but the accumulated magnificence of 2 centuries of growth and loss and regrowth, of things planted by people long dead that had continued quietly to become extraordinary. They walked along the gravel path that bordered the south garden, and for a time neither of them spoke, and the silence was nothing like the silences of 3 days ago. Not a test, not a contest, not a calculation. It was simply 2 people walking in the same direction, in the cold afternoon light, with the sound of their footsteps on the gravel, and the smell of damp earth and late roses, and the distant wood smoke from the house. He asked her how long she had been in the city. She told him. He asked about her work. She told him that too, without the careful editing she had applied to every previous conversation, without managing what she gave and what she withheld, because the withholding, she realized, was no longer serving any purpose. He stopped walking near the far end of the garden, where a stone bench sat beneath an old yew tree, and he turned to face her, with the directness that she had noted in him from the beginning, the quality of a man who has decided to say the thing and is saying it. "I would like to know you better," he said. "Not as a claimant, not as a problem I failed to anticipate, as the person you actually are, which I suspect is considerably more than I have so far had the opportunity to understand." He paused. "I am aware that I have given you no particular reason to extend that courtesy to me. I am asking anyway." She looked at him in the thin afternoon light, beneath the dark canopy of the yew, with the smell of autumn all around them, and the sound of the house at a comfortable distance. She thought of her father's letters, a man who understands obligation, and she thought of the document with his name restored to it, sitting now in Pembridge's files, permanent and on record and no longer a secret the world had swallowed. "Ask me again in the spring," she said at last, "when the garden looks like something worth staying for." He looked at her for a moment. Then quietly, he smiled. And it was, she thought, the most unguarded thing she had seen from him in 4 days. Spring came slowly to Aldermoor, as it always does in houses that hold the cold inside their stone walls longer than the outside world has any patience for. But it came. The roses along the south garden came back first, tentative, then committed, then extravagant in the way of things that have survived a difficult season and intend to make their survival known. The elms along the road put their leaves back on one branch at a time, with the unhurried confidence of trees that have been doing this for a very long time and have no doubt that they will do it again. The grounds, which in November had shown their bones to the pale sky, filled themselves back in with green, and the house that sat at the center of it all felt, to those who lived and worked within it, like a place that had quietly, over the winter, become slightly different from what it had been before. Tobias noticed it first. He noticed most things first, by habit and by disposition, and what he noticed was that the hall, his hall, the one he had stood in for 31 years, the one he had watched fill and empty with the seasons, with the guests and the gatherings and the particular commerce of a world that prided itself on knowing who belonged, felt in some quality he could not have named precisely to anyone who asked, but which he understood completely within himself, like a place that had corrected something, not a large correction, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that happens when a thing that has been sitting at a slight wrong angle is quietly, without ceremony, set right. He felt it in the rooms. He felt it in the way the staff moved through their days. He felt it most of all in the way Lord Aldermoor moved through his own house, still precise, still exacting, but with a quality of ease that had not been there in November, as if something he had been carrying at a slight wrong angle had for him too been set down squarely. Isadora came back in April, when the garden looked like something worth staying for. She came through the front door, the main entrance, as she always had, and Tobias opened it for her and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and she walked into Aldermoor Hall with the same unhurried composure she had carried into it on a cold autumn evening 6 months before. The hall was not full of guests this time. It was simply itself, its old stone and its portraits and its Persian carpets and its particular quality of light in the late afternoon, falling in long diagonals through the tall windows and settling on the floor like something that had always been there and intended to remain. Lord Cassius Aldermoor was waiting at the far end of the hall. He had not arranged himself. He was simply there, the way people are simply there when they are not performing their presence for anyone. He looked at her as she crossed the room, and she looked at him, and the hall held them both. This hall that had once been told she did not belong in it, with the absolute, indifferent permanence of a place that has seen enough to know that the truest things rarely announce themselves at the door. They simply walk in and stay. Isadora Vane did not arrive at Aldermoor Hall with power. She arrived with something rarer than power, a name that deserved to be honored, a mind that had spent years preparing for a single conversation, and the discipline never to let what was done to her make her into someone she did not want to become. She collected what was owed. She restored what had been lost. And she walked back into that hall in the spring, not as an intruder, not as a claimant, but as herself, which had always been more than enough. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next story is already on its way. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to fight, quietly, patiently, without anyone watching, to make sure that someone who deserved to be remembered was not forgotten?